This is a lecture that I probably will give over the course of this week, see how far we get today. And I titled it Bunker Valentine or Bunker Valentine after the structure that is serving me as the focus point of this case study in local and, as it were, family history. So here, to start with, we have the North Atlantic. While a social historian who was practicing econometrics at one point said, never start a book or a lecture for that matter with a weather report. The climate, the landscape, and all of that, especially if you're trying to do a materialist account of history, are of course relevant. The North Atlantic is the focus, geopolitically speaking, of the National Socialist regime when it comes to warfare against the Western allies, chiefly the United States over here and Britain right here. And of course, the landscape of northern Germany itself has been shaped by water and wind over the many thousands of years, as we'll see in a minute. So here for you, a bit clearer with the boundaries shown and not the clouds. You can see that New York is over here, the focal point, that pin there, the location of the bunker I want to talk about. And this, of course, also is the main area of the operations of German submarines in World War II. You may be aware of a movie. Who has seen Das Boot, The Boat? Have you heard about the movie? Yeah, I'll return to that later in this lecture, probably not today. Now, if you look at the landscape of northern Germany, you can sort of see that it has been shaped by wind and by water. So first of all, water in its frozen aggregate state during the last great ice age pushed in glacial form down all the way to where you get the first kinds of small hills that really are deposits of material that the glaciers pushed ahead of them. The place that we're looking at here is right where that glacial plain ends and where you have the first hills that are deposited material. Then, of course, after the retreat of the glaciers and the rising sea levels, you can't see this here very well, but I'll point it out on one of the next maps. Catastrophic storm surges formed the coast in many places, like this place here. There's another one over there. There are legends confirmed by now of large trading ports swallowed by the waves in a storm in the 1300s. So the sea is always present. And here we're getting closer to the bunker that is the subject of the story. And here you have a map that shows the roads, the names of the cities, and so forth, rather than just the aerial photograph. The city of Bremen, the boundaries shown have changed very little from the 1930s. This reflects the communal boundaries since the territorial reforms that the Nazis actually did. The city of Bremerhaven is part of the city-state. It's a two-city state of Bremen and Bremerhaven. Another place that I wanted to pay attention to, the whole plain here, the landscape, speaking of water, is soggy. So for the longest time until the 19th century, when you had a movement of internal colonization driven by really by the British monarchy, because the electors of Hanover who ruled all this, that was the family whose heads of house you might know as George I, the II, and the III of American Revolution fame. And up until the rise to the throne of Victoria, because Hanover doesn't have female line of succession, this was governed by the British, and they considered this place, especially in the 18th century, as a prime location for internal colonization. So you can improve the land, you can drain it, you can build roads, you can dig out the peat of the bogs that is ubiquitous. So this whole landscape also has been somewhat resistant to conquest because it is just so soggy and muddy. But one place here, Esterwegen, I want to draw your attention to. This is another one that's going to become relevant for our story later. By now, the peat bogs are largely gone. But in places like these, you see here where it says Esterweger Dose, there are still these enormous areas left, now protected as national or natural parks of peat. Here, we're zooming in further, and the location of the bunker is right here. You have the northern part of the Weser River as it runs through Bremen. Originally, only the small part of Fegesack, which literally translates as wipe out the sack, which is because the barons that sat here wiped clean the money bags that the merchants had who passed by. They collected a river toll, where another river, the Lesum, which drains the Devil's Moor over here, the Teufelsmoor, is flowing into the Weser. And by this time, it's a substantial river. And this is relevant because, as you may be aware, the North Sea has strong tides. So high water and low water, low tide and high tide, are apart by several dozen feet. And because the Wadden Sea is so flat right up to the coast, when the sea recedes, you can actually walk out onto the sea floor for quite a bit and reach little islands that become connected to the land, kind of like on the French Atlantic coast. But the river is fully navigable by ocean-going vessels, especially so if you have high tide. You also need to protect it with levees, because if you have a combination of high tide, spring water runoff, and storm surge, you're going to need them. So here you have, with Google Street View today, the river landscape showing here the river, and then there is just like all kinds of facilities lined up that can make use of the access to water. And here, a typical levee with a gap that can be quickly closed with a massive metal block that can be pushed in to keep out the water. Behind the levee, you have a landscape that has been shaped for hundreds of years by independent, non-noble farmers with substantial holdings. That is a distinctive feature of North German social structure that can be traced back all the way to the Saxons, basically freeholding farmers. Unlike east of the Elbe River, where you have the reactionary large landowner class, the Junkers, that are so prominent in the rise of the Nazis to power. And in their view, not unlike the slaveholders in the South, to whom they've been compared in the literature, who were always about expansion, the Junker class looks east as land to colonize and settle. But this area here does not have these large landholdings and the accompanying class of exploited landless farm laborers. And in the East, that is also an ethnic issue, in that many of these farm laborers are Polish. And that is relevant to the exploiters. They look to Slavs, Russians, Poles, etc., as a lower class and as an ethnically subservient class of inferiors. Not so here. Unlike also in southern and southwestern Germany, where you do not have primogeniture and entail, meaning that farming as well as noble estates are broken up between the sons and inheritance, reducing them to smaller and smaller lots until they fall below the threshold of sustainability. Here you have entail, meaning you can subdivide the plot, and primogeniture, meaning it has all to go to the oldest son. So it remains independent, free farmers who are not nobles, but not serfs, and to have sustainable agricultural operations, to the point where in the Middle Ages, this got to be a pain in the neck for the Bishop of Bremen, so that he got the Pope to send a crusade in the year 1234 to take care of some of these peasants who were basically governing themselves in a kind of republican fashion. Unfortunately, as so many times with peasant uprisings in German history, this one was defeated. Nevertheless, the social structure remained intact, although, of course, all these farmers owed some sort of tithe to a bishop, but they were not in the same fashion subservient to territorial lords as elsewhere. And here on the right-hand side, we have a barn. This is two recently retrieved Google Street View imagery, Rekomer Straße, that leads up to the levee. And now we turn around on that same street, and here for the first time, we get a glimpse of the bunker that I want to talk about. So if you walk from the bus stop to what is nowadays the memorial site, this is where you pass by these farms. And of course, the brick cladding of these houses here is directly drawn from the landscape. There are clay pits all around this part of the area where the bricks are baked. And here you have an aerial view. The street view, I think, was about here that we were standing and looking. Now here you have the bunker, and look for the scale. This is 200 feet, so this is a big structure. The short side alone is about 300 feet. And then this goes all the way to the levee here, and then that's the river there. You can see that the top of it, the eastern part, is now covered in photovoltaic cells. And there's a visitor center in there and a memorial. But the western riverward side of the structure has moss vegetation, pockmarked by exploded bombs and so forth. In 1943, on a photograph taken by American Air Force, you can see here the landscape surrounding this bunker. Everything was sort of geared towards that focal point of feeding that project. In yellow, well, in this terrible lighting, everything looks yellow, but this here, these are the railroad lines. Then the dotted ones are narrow gauge. You have roads. Here's the river. Right on top, the bunker as a construction site. Now, what you also will see here, these circular features are fuel storage tanks. These are just the above ground parts. But whole heath up here is basically tunneled with fuel storage tanks. And this is one of many such locations in Germany where the doctrine of rapid armored motorized warfare that drove the Nazi war machine, what you might have referred to as Blitzkrieg, lightning war, found expression in the landscape, because you had to dig up, plow under, and rebuild a large part of the landscape to keep the fuel you need for these internal combustion engines that are driving your tanks, your air force, your submarines, your cruisers, and so forth. So fossil fuel, the need to procure it, to refine it, and to store it, and to burn it, is a major necessary obsession of the regime. And here, this is visible in the landscape. Not far from here, near Soltau in the Lüneburg Heath, there's another such massive facility, and they're everywhere once you start looking. In the area here, visible, if you know what you're looking for too, you can see barracks interspersed, because the construction site of the bunker is not the only major project, major industrial site. There are shipyards, there's a power plant here, there's there have been, since the 1880s, in these parts of Bremen, textile mills for spinning, combing, and weaving wool, shipbuilding, metalworking, and so forth. So this is just focused on a military project, although, of course, in World War II, when we have total warfare, meaning that all of society in all its aspects is constantly regarded with a view of how does it serve the war purpose. But this is a special kind of focus. So there is labor camps here. There are camps that house slave labor. This is the construction site as in 1944. Now, you will find, if you look even just cursorily, that the people who were involved in planning this monstrous structure were incredibly proud of their achievement. The logistics involved in this were daunting. Construction began in 1943, right around the time that things started not looking so good on the Eastern Front. In that year, in the Battle of Stalingrad, the German army suffered its first major defeat. And from that point onward, it was basically a slow, steady, and accelerating rollback with the Soviet army driving back the Nazi forces into Germany. But in the West, it looked like it was possible to hold back the Allies if only you cranked out enough submarines that could also go undetected by the new generation of destroyers with sonar, depth charges, and so forth. Further down the river, here you have a power plant that was already in place at the time, just kind of for a context of how, in spite of what I was saying earlier, you know, the landscape is shaped by farming. Nevertheless, industry is already a major presence. So it's not like the Nazis brought industrialization here. And then, of course, one of the major industrial facilities is the shipyard, Vulcan Shipyards, named after the god who is in charge of industry and fire and also warfare, Hephaestus, or Vulcan in the Latin. This is a place that had been around since the 1880s. It too, returning to the subject of agricultural society, settler colonialism in the East and so forth, attracted thousands of ethnically Polish German citizens from the East. And also from outside of the boundaries, inside Congress Poland, which was governed by Russia, less so Volhynia, which was governed by the Austro-Hungarians. So this is a place where dozens of submarines were already built. But as you can imagine, in 1943, clearly air supremacy has been lost, and American and British bombers are conducting daily raids night and day, and they're trying to hit especially these industrial facilities. Amazingly enough, and this goes to speaks to the low level of development of technology, most of the bombs miss. It is one major hit in 1943. Other than that, it is almost all civilian targets, even when this was not one of these targets, but the goal was to wipe out a city, as was in Leipzig and Hamburg. This was really supposed to be targeted, but just badly targeted. Nevertheless, the search is on for a facility to build submarines that is bomb-proof. And so the bunker is the point. Here again, you see strategically, Bremen is the end point of the deep sea navigation channel that the Weser River forms. So it's perfect, it's far enough inland, but you can just roll out the submarines and take them right out into the North Sea for a spin. And this would have been the miracle weapon, the Type 21 U-boat. It has a diesel power plant that is used primarily to recharge its batteries. Other than that, it's an electrical U-boat with the benefit that it can operate incredibly stealthily and quietly. So the idea was that large numbers of these would turn around the war, would starve Britain and America, and would force them to settle, possibly with leverage to get the Western allies on board with what people like Goering considered in a speech he gave after Stalingrad, an obvious thing, that we, Western, racially superior white people, must take out the communists and the Jewish menace and the Asian menace that lurks behind them. So naturally, the Nazis figured, if not for the corrupt, money-grubbing, quasi-Jewish leadership of Roosevelt and Churchill, these would be natural allies against communism, as well as in the project of Protestant, Anglo-Saxon, white global supremacy. So it might just take a little nudge, and type 21 here was going to be that thing. So here, the Vulcan shipyards would be in charge of the manufacturing of these vessels. And before I continue, this is where the family history comes in. The Vulcan shipyards up until 1996, when they basically went under in an age of globalization where Western capital shifted production at that point to South Korea, where essentially venture capital firms bought and built up shipyards to outcompete and put out of business the unionized ones in the West. And this also affected, of course, the United States. If you're from Oakland or from Los Angeles, you will know that this devastated those cities as well. So Bremen is one of them. And the only thing that kept shipbuilding in Western countries in business at that time in the 1990s was strategic consideration. You have to have naval armament capability to build. So before 1933, when the Nazis gained power, this shipyard with its almost 5,000 workers was a stronghold of labor unions. You had social democrats, anarchists, Trotskyists, the whole shebang, communists, represented by one union. So it's not a craft union, but an industrial union model, metal workers. That union was broken up in April of 1933. Leadership arrested down to the shop steward level and sent first to what we call wild, spontaneously set up concentration camps, where the SA thugs that had been giving street battle to these activists, these left-wing activists for years, finally got to have their way with them. And the authorities were not quite yet paying attention. So these are pre-concentration camps that, if you can imagine it, were worse, more personal, more sadistic. So nevertheless, the shipyard remained a relatively safe spot to maintain a Communist Party resistance cell throughout World War II. And I have by word of mouth that in some of the working class neighborhoods, it was still quite possible for a group of communist youths to swarm and beat to a pulp any Nazi that set foot in the neighborhoods in the 1940s and get away with it. And yet, you always have, Gestapo lurking and trying to find weaknesses and openings. The ownership of the shipyard, which, by the way, was barely affected by the Great Depression, they were doing extremely well throughout. And in the 1930s, we're cranking out orders for foreign countries, mostly. And this was working together with the regime to bring in foreign currency. So they offered, the regime was subsidizing cheap shipbuilding for foreign orders But nevertheless, for the workers here, this worked out well. The one man who collected most of the money from this 80% stock ownership was Heinrich Thyssen. And he is one brother of, I think, 2 or 3. He managed to remain outside of Germany and maintain plausible deniability when it comes to the Nazi regime. Whereas, of course, the entire manufacturing class, the club of the Chamber of Commerce in the Rhineland, and these people, the steel, coal industry, the railroads and all that, they were fully behind Hitler. I mean, they financed the Nazis' rise to power until finally in 1933, they paid off the whole last election campaign debt of the party. Why? Because, well, we'll talk about that more, but the goals that Hitler fought for, that the Nazis fought for, expansion into the East, access to cheap labor, resources, land, settlement opportunities for German workers as a safety valve for class conflict, all of these things, these groups of manufacturers had been pushing for since at least 1900. So the All-German Association that drew up maps that showed what would be German. And then in World War I, of course, that already drove policy. That was part of this social trend. But Heinrich Thyssen, residing in the Netherlands for the most part of the 1930s, eventually moving to Switzerland, where on the Italian side of the country, he had a nice villa with lake view and an art collection that can now be seen in Düsseldorf, which is basically his native area, maintained his distance from the Nazis politically, washed his hands of the atrocities, and profited like no one else from their exploits, and was perfectly fine with it. But for the leadership of the shipyard, this meant that they were able to have a free hand. They could do what they wanted with the business. Of course, they tried not to run it into the ground, but they worked hand in glove with the regime and its goals. And that was the point of it. They thought, as did this entire social class, that the goals of the Nazis were in their interest. This was their project. This had been their project all along. And after 1940, when naval rearmament started for real, business was even better. Now, I owe my life to this place in many different ways. The skilled workforce there was indispensable for war material production. That shielded people from the draft, including my grandfather, who otherwise might have been sent, almost certainly would have been sent to the war, like my grandmother, his wife, saw happen to 7 of her 8 brothers, all of whom ended up dying in the Battle of Stalingrad, fighting for a regime that had previously locked up and tortured their father in a concentration camp for being a Union member. So my grandfather was spared that because he was one of the people working there. And then, of course, that I am here with a PhD and with an education at a grammar school and a college education is because of the struggles of these people who fought for a union and who made sure that you had a decent welfare state, free college, healthcare, housing, and all those things. So in that sense, I'm not a fan of positionality and whatnot, but materially speaking, that I'm here to tell this story is, of course, because of this place. So my family history is enmeshed with it. The people who ran the shipyard, and of course, this would involve many of the workers, because once the engineers and the business managers are done drafting, they're the next level that gets involved. They know what belongs together and what you can do with the material. So they were not innocent in this. But the Vulcan shipyard, with its knowledge base, with its skilled workforce and engineers, was leading the project to build a bunker to manufacture the submarines to turn around the war on the Atlantic. Just how seriously the Nazis took this may be illustrated by this map. You have here the front lines from 1943, October, which is after Stalingrad, until May 1945, capitulation. Everything that is not bright red, like up until here, was German control in October of 1943, right around the time when construction of this bunker began. When the country capitulated in 1945, this little pocket here, the Courland pocket that you might have heard about, was still held. Not by accident, because it had been cut off by the advancing Soviet armies, but deliberately to maintain the port located here with access to the Baltic Sea, so that you could have a zone of operation for training, etc., and maintenance of the submarines away from bombing rates. So that's how important they took this, that of the very last blue spots on the map, this was one of them. And of course, we think of 1945 as a time when it was all over. Well, no. If you look at the map in February, 3 months before capitulation, that's how much territory was still under Nazi control. And everybody there was being driven or working willingly towards the final victory, as they called it, the Endsieg. Many people believing that there was a miracle weapon that the leadership was keeping. And that's why they were luring the enemies deep into the empire and then to strike. Of course, there wasn't. It was all sort of delusions, but part of what came closest to that actually existing was this Type 21 submarine, to the point that anybody in the political leadership believed the mythology of miracle weapons. They imagined that to be one. So here you have a diagram of the production facility. This is a top-down view of the bunker. And you see here the drawings numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It goes down this way, up here, down that way, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. And 13 is a tank or basin where the finished product would be lowered. So you have these 13 workstations where prefabricated component parts, modular, delivered by barge or rail, manufactured across Germany, will be brought together and then in a production flow system, which very much looks like a Fordist factory. And you know that Henry Ford was a big hero of the Nazis and vice versa. So this would be the pinnacle of German engineering, meeting Taylor, Ford's chief engineer, to eventually build 16 U-boats a month. That was the goal. And it would be bomb-proof. They could bomb it as often as they would want. The concrete would be solid. Here, you have a view from inside the bunker. We are about here, I want to say. We're pretty much exactly here looking this way. So we're looking only at half the bunker, and the breadth of the place, that's also only half of it. And you see by the human scale of the figures we're looking at the exhibit, and it's like cold and drafty, and it's a forbidding place, and it's spooky too, just how humongous this is. Here you have a view from the roof of the bunker as it is being built onto the northern construction site. You see the sprawling area where everything is focused towards putting this place together. And here, returning to the question of who's in charge of this, I said the Vulcan shipyards were project leaders, design, construction, etc. But if you look at this diagram here, which shows what is there on this northern construction site, metalworking, concrete mixing, construction companies, what have you, all the steel weaving that needs to be done for reinforcement. Here it reads like a who's who of German industry. They're all on board with it. They're all willingly cooperating. They're all working together towards the final victory against Bolshevism. And this is just the northern end of the construction site. Here's the bunker. This way is north, or this way rather. And there is the southern side as well. So any industry, any major companies in German industry you missed in the list here, the Beteiligte companies involved in the construction process, you might find here. Because, and this is all companies that after the war ended up doing quite well for themselves still. So there was no thought ever of refusing to go along with it, resistance. There was only an eagerness to make this happen, driven by the assessment that this is a war and this is a regime that is in the interest of capital, that is good for business. Krupp, Siemens, MAN, the bus manufacturer, and other names that you may not know because they're not operating outside of Germany much, but that are household names there. Who built this? The exploitation of labor and resources is, of course, what this aggressive form of imperialism, that is about conquering territory to enslave people and to steal the resources, is all about. So it shouldn't be a big surprise to find that this facility was built largely with slave labor. Where did they find the slave labor? As the plan suggested, mostly among Slavic people, Russian prisoners of war, Polish partisans, Danes, Dutchmen, Frenchmen, Italians, Austrians, anybody who in some way, shape, or form had been suspicious of being a potential resistance fighter or had said something critical of the Nazis, was sent to these camps. There were also camps for Germans who had been on welfare, who were considered reluctant to work, who had been labeled as inherently anti-social, like unwilling to contribute to the common good by not putting in an honest day's work, who then also were forced to work in these camps. So this was the workforce. And this was the leadership. Here you have in August 1944, a couple of the project leaders, engineers, high-ranking ones, and CEOs who are on that construction site looking at the progress. Documentation, as is common in Germany, was always provided in writing, in diagrams, in project plans, and also with photography and film. So throughout, because this was supposed to be a template for future construction efforts. And I have to admit, I witnessed how the center of Berlin, which had been bombed out and hadn't been rebuilt until reunification in the 1990s, which was basically a wasteland on prime urban real estate, was built up. You had like sprouting skyscrapers within a decade. The way this was laid out, the way the logistics were done, and the way they bragged about the logistics in the little booth that you could visit where they explained the whole thing. It never occurred to me until I visited here and looked at the exhibit that this was the exact damn same thing. What they learned here, they're still doing. So if you're looking for capitalist modernization, how you figure out how to maximize the use you get out of people and resources, and how to organize things as efficiently as possible, this would be one of those places. The person here, Erich Lackner, who is quoted from a 1981 radio interview, once people started paying attention to this place again, because most people after the war wanted to forget about it, said, as an engineer, I have nothing to blame myself about. This was great work. I'm still some of my best work, proud of it. And when they asked him about the forced laborers, he said, everybody had the same working conditions. We all worked together. And I had nothing to do with it. With the thing that wasn't, with which there was nothing wrong, I wasn't guilty of that. So this is what they would all say after all. And he was in charge of the ports in Bremen, like draining, dredging, building, maintaining port facilities. And by all accounts, he did a splendid job of it too. But if you look at if you go now and abandon the global perspective, the North Atlantic, the landscape, the geopolitical perspective, the planning, the diagrams, and really look at the ground level, it gets incredibly horrific and ugly. So here you have a photograph of Soviet prisoners of war being told to hop to it by a German Marine. Here you have a first-hand account by a Russian who worked here. I witnessed 2 prisoners being executed for sabotage. They had cut off a piece of shoe leather and exchanged it for bread from a German civilian. And they were executed for that. So the situation was so desperate that they would cut up the soles of their own shoes to have something to trade in for eating. This was almost, in a perverse way, a reflection of European unity. And of course, the common European economic area that the Nazis envisioned is not that different from the European Union, really. All the languages here, when you finally get a memorial in 1983 that describes what happened here, it's Polish, German, French, Russian, Dutch, English, and another Slavic language I don't recognize. And here you have the French in 1983 who had been inmates. Many of them were resistance fighters. So in their case, this was already as the Americans were advancing, who came here to lay down a wreath and have a ceremony at the opening. All in all, and this is just to say that this case was not an exception to the rule, but rather the rule, all in all, 13.5 million foreign forced laborers were brought to Germany during the war. And again, this was in large part the point of the whole thing. If you look at the All-German Association and the plans they drew up, this was the point. The photographs are few, where the forced laborers are in the picture. It is usually because they were trying to capture something else, but here you have a crowd forming for food distribution. Also in August of 1944. These are pictures taken in high summer. August would be warm. By all accounts, August of 44 was especially nice. And in the winter time, you can just imagine how desperate this would get. And here you have, with typical German bureaucratic efficiency, stamps and numbers and signs to retrieve the file by the cover of the collection of photographs that document the mounting of this steel and concrete element that is being placed on top of the bunker structure. So all in all, you're looking at 10 to 12,000 people who worked on this construction site as slave laborers over the 2 years. Here's another picture. And here's another between 2,000 and 6,000 died in the span of, I want to say 16 to 18 months. So death was a daily occurrence. Some people were simply murdered by guards, others died by starvation, exhaustion, industrial accidents, broken bones that weren't treated, that kind of thing. So it is now time to wrap this up. And that is why we will continue from this point